James, should we start by talking about Nat Con and about the response to, what was it,
It was May last year.
Yeah, so almost a year ago, exactly. And I was one of the speakers, and the response to it was fairly amazing.
Yeah,
in the media,
it was. And to be honest, I think the fact that we were able to put on a conference like that at all was remarkable. I mean, 2 or 3 years before, I remember going to the National Conservatism conference in Rome, and the Tory central office, if I recall correctly, effectively put a ban on all Tory MPs attending. I think one of them did attend, but it was the idea of Conservatives coming together and talking about sovereignty, talking about nationhood, talking about family in early 2020 was completely beyond the Overton window. And so when we initially started discussions about whether it could work in the UK ecosystem, I was quite skeptical. I wanted it to happen, but I wasn't sure we could pull it off. This is the summer of 22. But over time, the politics was shifting very, very fast. We were, there was a growing sense of disillusion in the aftermath of Brexit on immigration. There were all sorts of developments on the social conservative front, sort of social conservatism 2.0. People talking about family, people talking about men and women. All the culture wars issues was really starting to emerge in a way that we hadn't really seen before. And it wasn't the old social conservatism. It wasn't about abortion. It wasn't about gay marriage. It was a set of issues that seemed to forge a remarkable kind of coalition. I think sort of led by conservatism, lots of ways. I think there were disproportionately many conservatives involved, actually lots of Christians too, but also people from the left, people who were much more kind of liberal in their outlook, feeling that progressivism was just going too far. And so we pushed ahead with it and put it together very fast. I mean, I think we made the decision to put it on in January last year, and then we put it on 4 months later. And so putting it on at all, I think, was an impressive achievement, and had a great team working with me, a lot of Israelis and 1 or 2 Americans, and the task was to make it as British as possible. So we got a lot of fire after the conference for being, I think, one of the accusations that we were a sort of GOP Trojan horse. But the fact is, of the 60-odd speakers, I think we had about 3 Americans. Almost all were Brits. I think of the 1,000 or so attendees, 40% were under 30, which for a conservative gathering is pretty astonishing. And they weren't young guns from SW1. They weren't spads and think tank wonks and so on. A lot of them were from outside the M25. A lot of them were working class lads and ladies. And so there was a sense of real energy there, which I don't think you would get at a Tory party conference. There was a pretty good gender spread too. I mean, we weren't obsessing over that, but I think it was about 70-30, 70% men, 30% women, which again, for a gathering of that kind is pretty unusual. And I think we put a lot of debates on the table that had not really been put on the table before, but have been dominating the news cycles and policy debates ever since. I mean, particularly the conjunction of the demographic crisis and fertility crisis with immigration. So day one of the conference we had was the focus was on what was your panel, actually. We were talking about families, we were talking about fertility, talking about men and women, and in the afternoon we're talking about the migration crisis. And that conjunction sparked some really important discussions. Danny Kruger then did a speech the following morning, gathering together all those threads and talked about, I can't remember the language now, but he used the word normative. That was the spooky word
I'd forgotten about that. Yes,
which created a real firestorm. He talked about, I think, a married mum and dad raising up children together in an intact household, and this is the normative ideal, not the only way that you can form a family, but it was something that we should aspire to and think about when we're fixing tax policy. And so that I was, really proud of that. And we, national conservatism, in a way, it's a contradiction in terms. The very fact that you have to attach the word national to conservatism really is a symptom of the problem that conservatism has got itself into. It's a symptom of the kind of globalist turn of most right-wing movements in the West over the last 30, 40 years. The left has been, the DNA of the left has always been a lot more internationalist. There's always been a sense of that they're operating in a kind of global lockstep. Workers of the world unite, and it's wokesters of the world unite. This is progressivism is a global ideology. That's not the case for conservatism at its roots. It was. We were just amazed at the impact it had, and we felt that we'd spotted a gap, a sort of, I don't know, gap in the market, but a gap in this sort of space of conservative debate, and there's never really been a forum, a clearinghouse for small c conservative ideas. It's always been, if you want to talk about these issues in a conservative context, you're literally on the fringe. You're on the fringe of, the October Party conference, and it's really dominated by the sort of agenda is set by CCHQ and the Tory party. That's not the case, for example, in America. I'm not a fan of what's it called, CPAC and other conventions like that, but there are spaces on the other side of the Atlantic where conservatives of very different hues can come together and hash out their disagreements and identify promising solutions. And so I think as a forum, it's much needed. And we're really just delighted with how it went. And we were thrilled that it sparked conversations that have been going ever since. And I think also the reaction that it provoked showed, just what a problem confronts ordinary conservative people with ordinary conservative views. Even to talk about the family, to talk about nationhood, talk about God. Even, we put faith questions on day 3 because we didn't think it made sense to ignore those. Those debates have been going strong too. Obviously, the way we approach God questions is very different from the United States, but we can't ignore them. So altogether, it was a success, and we're going to do another one, and we're going to keep it going, and we're going to make sure it's a regular fixture of the political calendar.
I was also very struck by how young the room felt, and how young and female the room felt. Because as you say, if you've been to Tory Party conference or any other sort of similar event, young and female, it does not feel. But the number of women, for instance, I saw or spoke to, young women, often very stylishly dressed. It really didn't have that energy. The old William Hague, young fogey kind of stinky tweed jacket energy, which young conservatism does struggle to shrug off. It didn't have that. Lots of young, stylish people, and lots of crucifixes around the neck as well. I noticed it did have quite a strong Christian energy, even though, of course, Yoram Hazony is Jewish, and lots of Israeli organisers, as you mentioned. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that NatCon is part of obviously a global network of these events, and there's one coming up in, is it Washington soon? which I sadly can't go to. But I did think that NatCon in London had a distinctively British flavour, which was, of course, the goal.
Yeah, it wasn't easy to pull off because we're balancing all sorts of different constituencies. So, the libertarians were irritated that the conference was happening at all, even though I platformed Dan Hannan and Lord Frost was there and Jacob Rees-Mogg. So we didn't ignore the libertarians. We didn't ignore the free marketeers. We recognised they have a place in the conservative movement. But I think we got them in the right sort of proportion. And I think we captured the essence of the 2019 realignment, which is, roughly moving left on economics and right on culture. And I think that's exactly the kind of election winning mix that the Tory party at the moment has just completely ignored and just actively rejected.
Yeah, I mean, I was not the only person to comment on this afterwards, that the criticisms that were levelled at some people involved in NatCon, including me. So I, for instance, spoke about pronatalism and support for young families and so on. And I had some criticisms later from people saying, what are you talking about? Conservative austerity has completely undermined the family, two-child benefit cap, closure of Sure Start centres, whatever it is, failing to understand that actually the NatCon conference is definitely not synonymous with the Conservative Party.
Yeah.
And in fact, there was a lot of criticism of the Conservative Party from the speakers, and plenty of hostility from the Conservative Party towards it as well, even though, of course, the Home Secretary spoke and so on. So these things are not by any means the same project.
Yeah. I think the criticism stems from the fact that nothing like the NatCon conference had ever happened before in the Conservative space. It has happened on the left. You have seen sort of feet to the fire movements emerging that are outside the normal, exist outside the normal sort of party political infrastructure. But I think, sort of big Tory ecosystem simply didn't know what to make of it and had never come across anything like that before. So I think a lot of the journalists responded or reacted as if it was some sort of offshoot of, the right wing of the Tory party, which it wasn't at all. And I think that speaks to the need for, a convention like that, a kind of a clearinghouse for Tory conservative ideas that exists outside the sort of the party system, and that is not aligned to, we're not backing any particular political party. We platform speakers that we think are consistent with the vision. But we're not, as many journalists try to imply, on maneuvers. We weren't trying to, take over a caucus of the party or anything like that. But we're simply providing oxygen for debates that ought to be happening within the Tory party.
And I think it's really evident there's a hunger for that. And indeed, we're speaking now a year later when the Conservative Party is potentially facing election wipeout, is facing up to the fact that actually the public are clearly not. Two problems. One, I suppose, is that the double liberals have captured the Conservative Party so successfully, and double liberalism is just deeply unpopular with voters. And two, I think it's also sort of evident that the Conservative Party doesn't. In some senses, it's always existed as a vehicle for power, and the most successful political party in the world can't really help but do that. It exists basically to secure and maintain power, but it's evidently failing right now at doing that. And I think that, yes, the attitude towards NatCon, I think, tells you everything that you need to know in that sense. The hostility towards a set of debates and ideas that are actually very popular and people are hungry for, including, young female students and so on who may be unexpectedly interested in this stuff.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. And, there was really the platform that we were offering was totally consistent with the vision that was laid out, or at least I think with the spirit of the 10, 11, 12 million who voted for the Tories in 2019. So, it was outside the M25. These were issues that were just, completely standard, and what the country at large wanted. And, most of the positions, completely toxic within SW1, but enormously popular outside it.
Yeah, there are so many issues on which that's true. It constantly amazes me. I always say, I sometimes feel as if I am represented within kind of media land or SW1 as being very right wing, having very unusual views. And I say, if you look at every YouGov tracker of public opinion, I am basically bang in the middle of every single one. I actually have remarkably representative views, just not representative views of someone of my class and education background. I've just somehow magically managed to withstand my education and still arrive at these positions.
Absolutely right. And that problem will persist for as long as there isn't a grassroots movement that is pushing these issues systematically, regularly, in a way that, as it were, makes them acceptable opinions. And that means that, we need people like you. We need people who are, as it were, within the opinion forming classes, who can articulate the positions and explain why they are so popular, why they're needed. And I think the Conservatives have effectively had a complete stranglehold. The Tory party has had a stranglehold on all of the main mechanisms of kind of organising kind of consent and elite opinion, and there's simply been no incentive for them to change that. And occasionally you will have a party popping up. You'll have a UKIP or a Reform that will maybe that make them panic a little bit, but then a containment strategy will be deployed, and there'll be things are sort of handled that way. So the aim of NatCon is to kind of develop and to feed that movement, and to give voice to the views, the outlook of the overwhelming majority of people on these issues that are just too toxic for those in Islington dinner parties.
Or indeed Cambridge dinner parties. I want to ask about some of the free speech battles within universities that you've also been involved with. Because, of course, the university sector, probably above all others, maybe the exception might be charity sector, has been very successfully captured by progressivism. And someone with the modal views of the general public is absolutely not welcome to speak in a lot of university venues.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. It wasn't always the case. The kind of groupthink really took off, I suppose, probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Think of all the big battles between Thatcher and the universities, which led to the 1986 Education Act, which was the first time the government started trying to address the problem of groupthink within the universities. It was in principle, quite a good piece of legislation, protecting visiting speakers, protecting staff and students from incursions on their freedom of speech and on academic freedom. But it's turned out to be completely toothless. It was hardly ever enforced. And then I think about, I suppose, 2012, 2013, the kind of cultural revolution is really gathering pace and sweeping across universities in the States, and then beginning to really hit the universities here. I wasn't really aware of it until I think it was 2014. I'd just gone over to Oxford for to do a research fellowship, and I remember organising or helping to organise a debate on abortion this must have been around about November 2014, which was created a real firestorm. And naively, I thought that this was a group of feminists who just didn't want the abortion issue to be discussed at all. But I went and had a cup of coffee with one of the people who cancelled or forced Christchurch, the college, to cancel the event, and I pointed out that although we had invited two men to debate the issue, this wasn't something that we always did. And the following term, we were organising an event that was actually entirely women, and so on. And I remember, I'll never forget what she said. She said, "No, the problem was not that you invited two men. The problem was that you invited two men." What was it? What did she say? Yeah, that two men who were cis. And I said, "Well, what on earth is cis?" And she had to explain to me the transgender ideology. I'd never really come across it before. And I said, "So if we'd invited two people for whom it would be a biological impossibility ever to be faced personally with the issue of whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, you would have been okay with that?" And she said, "Yes." And that was a sort of Damascene moment for me. I suddenly sort of found myself peering into this abyss of the Cultural Revolution as it was beginning to break in Oxford. And I think that was a wake-up call for me. I really thought, my goodness, things have changed at a speed that I hadn't fully understood. This is no longer the old debates that we saw in the 80s and the 90s between left and right, which had broadly, when I was an undergraduate in the late 90s, had pretty much vanished. I mean, it was a real sort of, it was a real kind of Fukuyama climate. Nobody was really interested in politics at all in late 90s, early noughties. It just wasn't an issue. So at that point, 2014, 2015, and then Brexit, of course, and I've been a Brexiteer since I grew up in Brussels. I've been a Brexiteer since I was 13, 14, and it quickly became apparent that I was the only member of my college who at least was out of the closet on the Brexit issue. And I realised also that there wasn't a single member of staff, not a single porter, not a single gardener or groundsman who was a Remainer. And so we had this extraordinary split. All the butlers and all the porters, all the kind of the people who made the place run were diehard Brexiteers, and all of us, almost all of us, were for Remain. And so that too sort of made me realize just how fragmented we were now as a society. And I then came over to Cambridge, back to Cambridge in, I think, 2018, 2019. And then there was a whole series of events, sort of cancelled speakers, young junior researchers who didn't have tenure, getting fired or reprimanded or put through kangaroo courts. And those were very helpful incidents, although they didn't go to the heart of the problem, which is much, much deeper than a speaker being cancelled. They did, I think, concentrate the mind of the sort of the attention of the media and the general public on what was happening within our institute, within our sort of the most important sort of meaning-making, sense-making institutions we have.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. One of the things, if you don't mind my saying, I think one of the things that you're very good at as a somewhat dissident academic is finding the right places to push and then pushing just hard enough. So inviting speakers who you know are going to cause a ruckus, but also who are so obviously appropriate for, so like for instance, inviting Jordan Peterson to come and speak at Cambridge, you know, one of the most famous, successful public intellectuals in the world, obviously going to draw an enormous crowd, obviously going to be enormously popular wherever he goes, and yet can't step foot on a university campus, particularly Cambridge, without attracting protests and so on. I think these are the sort of incidents that then people see in the newspapers and they think, what is going on what is going on in these institutions?
Well, you're giving me, it's very kind of you to say so, but you're giving me way too much credit. I mean, with him, I think we met 2018 or so, and just a very, very long dinner, very long conversation. I'd not really heard of him and didn't understand at that time what all the fuss was about. But the conversations evolved, and I think at that point I was still in Oxford, but coming over to Cambridge, and then this fellowship was arranged for him. And anyway, we thought it would be, really productive. And he's got some quite unusual, idiosyncratic views on religion, and we thought that grounding him in Cambridge for a term would do him a lot of good. And it wasn't meant to be a provocative move. But then when he was ousted from the fellowship, because of the scale of his following, it just hit the headlines, and it all really got wildly out of control. And I felt a bit bad for my colleagues in the Faculty of Divinity here in Cambridge, because I don't think there's any other faculty in Oxford or Cambridge that would have even confirmed the initial invitation. I mean, often it's the case, that the institutions that often are kind of at the sort of that bear the brunt of these sort of cancellation scandals reputationally are often the ones that are willing to at least sort of take the kind of risks that the really, really captured progressive institutions are not willing to take at all. And so anyway, that and a number of other incidents, it has changed the climate a little bit. And I would say that on balance, the sort of intellectual culture in Oxford and Cambridge is far, far better than what you would find in Harvard or at Stanford or Princeton or Yale. It is still the case that, I don't know, I could count on one hand the number of conservative academics I know here in Cambridge. But I don't feel in any way sort of persecuted for the views that I hold. I just feel that, there isn't the sort of quality of informed debate that we ought to be modelling for the general public. And, whether it's on climate or race or gender or sexuality or Brexit, you would want there to be, not parity, not a kind of 50-50 necessarily, but, if it was 70-30, 80-20 on a contentious issue, that would be, that would give the kind of oxygen we need for good, informed discussion. But it's not that. I mean, once you hit a certain tipping point, then groupthink really sets in. And, once you've got a spread of 90, 10, 95% of people taking one particular view on a highly contentious ideological position, then the purity spirals really, really start, and minority opinion is demonized. And I've said this before, that the problem with groupthink is that wrong think becomes evil think. You become, your views are not just wrong, but morally suspect. and that's cancer for any intellectual culture that prizes truth or prizes the pursuit of truth. So, we've seen those incidents in Cambridge, whatever it was, 3 or 4 years ago, and there are others in Oxford, there are others in Cardiff and Exeter and elsewhere, did prompt a serious debate at the highest levels of government. And one of the very, very few manifesto pledges that the Tories seem to have honoured is taking a close look at what can be done in higher education policy. And this discussion crystallised into a policy commitment to primary legislation focusing on academic freedom, and that was passed last year. The Freedom of Speech Higher Education Act, and that's coming into force properly on the 1st of August, unless Labour try to torpedo it, which I think is unlikely.
What will the Act contain? How's it going to change things?
So what it does is it effectively it creates a piece of infrastructure, specifically a position, the Director of Academic Freedom, a kind of academic freedom czar, who sits within the Office for Students. And the person who's appointed to that was my colleague Arif Ahmed, a brilliant professor of philosophy here in Cambridge. He's now resigned to take up this role full time. And the legislation effectively puts very strong statutory obligations on universities, not just to kind of defend academic freedom, but to actively promote it as something that should be an institutional value that should have priority over all others. And so you're going to see, it'll be a very interesting case study. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see how universities reconcile these statutory obligations with their pursuit of the EDI vision, which of course is laced through so much of the bureaucracy in all the big universities, but particularly in Oxford. I think Oxford employs 40 EDI commissars, spends I think about £2 million a year on them, and they, effectively what you're going to see is this sort of big collision between the EDI vision and the new duties under the Act. And so the question is, will the Act have the kind of teeth that it needs to slow that ideological juggernaut down? And it actually sparked a very interesting debate within conservative circles over, my initial reaction is, do we really want do we really want the government to have more kind of intervening muscle when it comes to the universities? Is that really a good idea? And so everything, my conservative instincts kind of balked at that initially. But I realised, as I think, people like DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin in the States have realised that, the time for sort of small government on these big cultural war issues is over. And if you don't use power when you've got it to try and instill some common sense and protect your own positions in the culture wars, then it's game over. And so it was an interesting move by the Conservatives because it was a government solution. It was a clear piece of primary legislation designed to address in many ways the taproot of the kind of ideological anarchy that's been incubated in the universities in the last couple of decades.
A big question, apologies, but hopefully a question that you have thought a lot about. I bet you have. What's the role of Christianity, do you think, in generating wokeness?
In generating wokeness?
Yeah, because this is quite a common critique from the sort of Nietzschean right, that wokeness is in some sense an inevitable product of various Christian ideas brought to their logical conclusion. I don't think that argument entirely stacks up, but I'm curious to hear what you think as both a Christian and a theologian and someone who, battles wokeness on a daily basis.
I agree. It's become quite a fashionable take, and it's not one that I've really always been on board with. I mean, it starts from the observation that the kind of ideological frenzy that attends wokeness does in some ways have the characteristics of religion, of a kind of that there's a sort of zealousness, there's a kind of an evangelism, there's a sense that woke views are almost, they have the sort of existential significance that your views about the role of the state just don't have. And so I think there is some truth to that. But of course, noting that human beings have, religious instincts, and that politics can be sacralized is not an especially kind of novel observation. I mean, it's just a deep anthropological fact about human beings, that we are oriented to interpret the world in a way that, and to interpret the world and to sacralize the world. So, the father of sociology, Emile Durkheim, makes this point in his great Elementary Forms of Religious Life, that we all moral communities, as they try and organize themselves, will have certain focal points. They work out what's sacred, they work out what's taboo, and so you'll see this in any society. So the sort of woke equals religion observation is true, but I think trivially true. It's not particularly informative. In the case of, does woke have the fingerprints of Christianity? I mean, I think there is some truth to that. I mean, the sort of the inversion, the elevation of the victim, obviously is something that is incomprehensible to the pre-Christian pagan mind. That there's no, I don't think there's any real debate about that at all. But it can't just be it can't just be a Christian influence. It wouldn't explain the sudden emergence of woke, whenever it was, if we date it to 10, 15 years ago. So it may be that, parts of certain sort of Christian impulses are weaponized. But it doesn't quite, it doesn't explain why so much of the kind of Christian imagination, the Christian sort of moral universe is simply ignored or actively rejected. And with a phenomenon as complex as that, I mean, it's very tempting to come up with neat genealogies and to say, oh, this is a kind of metastasized Christianity or whatever. But they're just, there's so many other drivers for it, and so many other ways of understanding it, and so many there's so many claims that are completely antithetical to the kind of to Christian moral theology. I mean, identitarianism in particular is such a strange idea that kind of contingent physiological characteristics should assign you a particular position on a moral hierarchy. That could not be more different from the kind of egalitarian, sort of metaphysical egalitarianism that Christianity ushers in. I mean, it's also the case maybe that there's certain ideas that have kind of that are certainly inspired by Christianity, but which take on much sort of uglier forms once the kind of metaphysical underpinning of Christianity is taken away. I mean, I think moral equality as an ideal is a good example of this. Once upon a time, the way equality is understood between person A and person B is basically in metaphysical terms. We're equal before God, we're equal in sin, we're prince and pauper, kneel at the altar rail together. And so the sort of the language of the image of God and being children of God and so on, that's a sort of transcendent anchor for claims of equality. Once you take that anchor away, there's a sort of phantom limb syndrome. Modernity remembers the importance of equality, but has lost the metaphysical language to articulate it. And so it starts articulating it in the only ways that it can, normally in basically material ways. So to think of equality, we need to cash that out in terms of assets, or equality of assets, equality of income, equality of access to social opportunities, and so on. And then any disparities in the sharing of material goods, immediately that becomes a sign of inequality, which would have simply not made any sense at all to the Christian moral imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem with well, I mean, it can come in different forms, right? But let's say the anti-Christian, anti-woke position. There is also a a pro-woke, anti-Christian position, such. But the anti-Christian, anti-woke position is the periods of, say, British history when we have been most pious, where we have greatest church attendance, and the church has been strongest, etc., are very much not the periods when you also see the espousal of all these ideas associated with wokeness, right? Or even something like, I don't know, I mean, a very contentious subject within Christianity would be something like capital punishment, attitudes towards crime and punishment in general. You know, the period when, and it's quite common for people, sort of left-wing Christians, to say that capital punishment is incompatible with Christian belief, and I can see the argument. I mean, you can clearly take sections from the Gospels and make such conclusions. Then I think the period when this country was at its most Christian was also the period when capital punishment was completely inassailable as a state policy. So it just doesn't seem like the history lines up. That's kind of my problem with this.
Yeah.
Unless you say, well, this is, or as Tom Holland says, and as he said recently when he came on my podcast, that what we're seeing now is a new type of Christianity. It doesn't call itself Christianity. It rejects the church quite explicitly. It embraces all sorts of things which have been considered very anti-Christian up until 5 minutes ago within sort of Orthodox circles. But it is still, he would say, a different type of Christianity, and therefore has not much relation with, say, medieval Christianity or some other era.
Yeah, I mean, I think if once you start to cast the kind of semantic net so wide when defining Christianity, then everything is Christianity, and to some extent that's true. I mean, the West is so imprinted with the Christian moral reflexes that it's it's true that anything that comes after is going to still still going to bear that imprint. I mean, what we saw in capital punishment, we get rid of capital punishment, what is it, in 1961, and then we see all sorts of other big changes.
Exactly, at precisely the same moment that you see the embrace of, or the decriminalisation of abortion, of homosexuality, all these other things which seem to be very counter, at least, to historical.
That's right.
Christian position,
defiantly repudiating the Christian moral legacy. And I think, on capital punishment, the Catholic Church is interesting. It's only recently that the Catholic Church has started to express deep reservations about capital punishment. And in fact, it's not actually changed its teaching at the magisterial level, but Pope Francis has changed the wording of the catechism on it. And yes, I mean, before the 60s, it's not a problem. Capital punishment has traditionally not been a problem within the Christian moral imaginary, partly because, the principle that the punishment should fit the crime is one that seems to be a fairly central axiom of natural justice. And if you simply add to that the corollary that there are some crimes for which the permanent deprivation of liberty is simply not an adequate punishment, then capital punishment becomes, it's not difficult to see why it never troubled moral theologians up into the 20th century. And of course, along with the collapse of the kind of Christian imagination, you've got a very, very different attitudes towards death. So, I mean, Ernst Becker writes that great book on the denial of death, that there is something that comes, there's this sort of phenomenon that emerges in the wake of the Enlightenment in particular, and the kind of the materialization and the mechanization of human nature, this idea that biological death is death. And this comes to be an absolutely central assumption. The idea of any kind of moral dispensation or judgment beyond biological death becomes completely incomprehensible. But Christian teaching on capital punishment always carried with it the presumption that there would be a fair and maximally just moral determination of the offending soul after biological death. And of course, that makes no sense to the modern mind. So, no, I think you're right. I think it's very, very difficult indeed to see the 1960s as some sort of second Reformation, as opposed to a dramatic intensification of the kind of self-consciously irreligious individualism of the 18th century.
So you would see it as a just to break with Christianity, even if you can sometimes see Christianity's fingerprints, at least rhetorically. The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.